Good afternoon, Dr. Bevan. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in our Scientific Journeys project, where we are interviewing several different successful scientists and asking them how exactly did they make it? How exactly were their steps and their paths into getting into science, into getting their scientific goals and achieving them. So thank you very much for participating. And would you mind starting out by telling me a little bit about yourself, a little bit of background?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy to participate in this opportunity. I grew up in Ohio and attended a high school there, and then I went to college in Ohio as well at a small liberal arts college, Marietta College in Ohio. And then after college I actually was in the military for 3 years and then went to graduate school at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and it was in a chemistry department in both places, at Marietta and at Northwestern. And then I did postdoctoral work at a research institute in Minnesota that was associated with the University of Minnesota for 2 years, and then I came to Virginia Tech in 1980, so I've been here about 32 years, so a long time within the department here in biochemistry. I'm currently an assistant professor in biochemistry here at Virginia Tech.
Wow. Well, let's go and expand on something that you said before. One of the things you mentioned is that you were in the military before you went to graduate school. Can you expand a little bit upon that? What made you decide to go into the military? What branch? Maybe some experiences that you had?
Okay. Well, the reason I decided, if you will, is because at that time when I was in college there was still a draft, and so they instituted a lottery system about the time that I was a junior or senior in college, where they drew numbers for your birthday, and if you had a low number then there was a greater chance you would be drafted. My number was 9, so it was almost certain that I would be drafted, and in fact that was probably the fastest thing that happened as I was part of the military. Within 2 weeks of graduating I went from student status to be classified as 1A, which meant I was eligible for the draft, and then within 2 weeks after that I had a draft notice. What I elected to do was enlist in the Army rather than be drafted, so I had a little bit more flexibility or choice in terms of what I would do within the military.
Wow. That's definitely very interesting.
Yeah, no, actually as part of that, because you'd ask, experiences, so as part of that I was in various places around the world, within the U.S. I was in basic training at Fort Knox in Kentucky, and then I was stationed at a couple of places in Maryland, and then actually I spent a year in Vietnam. This was towards the end of the Vietnam War, or at least the American involvement, and then I was in North Carolina for a couple of years, and then got out in time to go to graduate school at Northwestern.
So was it any specific event or experience that happened while you were in the military that really drew you to science, or were you already drawn to the scientific field before then?
Yeah, I was already drawn to it. In fact, while I was an undergraduate, I'd been accepted into graduate school and was planning to go, but then as a result of the military obligation I had to postpone that. But Northwestern was extremely helpful. They basically said, whenever you're ready to come to graduate school, you don't need to reapply, just let us know and you'll be able to enter. So I was able to enter then 3 years after I normally would have. But in some ways it was beneficial. I had a different view of the world as I went to graduate school, and I think any experiences you have prepare you for things that come later. So I found it, although the kinds of things I was doing weren't scientifically related, at least I was doing things and meeting interesting people along the way.
Were you encouraged to pursue a career in the sciences? Were you encouraged to go to undergrad and go to graduate school?
Yes, well, we were encouraged to pursue our education. Certainly my parents, I was a first-generation college student. In my immediate family, my older sister, 2 years older, was the first to go to college, and then I followed, and we have another sister who's a few years younger than that. So we all were able to go to college, even though my parents had not. And in terms of getting into science, it was, I think, very much like probably a lot of people, you find things that really interest you when you're in school. And for me, it was science, so that wasn't the only thing I found interesting, and I looked at other possibilities as I think of things that interested me. One, during high school that I found some facility for was English, and I thought about pursuing that a bit. And although I didn't as a career in a sense, as a scientist, especially as you get into graduate school, you have to be able to write, and so those skills I think have helped me a lot.
Absolutely.
And that was really developed a lot also during undergraduate school. I was very lucky to have some very good faculty in different classes for freshman English, for technical writing, that were very encouraging. And even in high school, I had a couple of teachers who really helped in helping me think about how to write and so on. And so I really felt that that's really been a big benefit as I've continued in science, is being able to write, since we write so many grants and manuscripts and so on. Those skills have really been beneficial.
So you mentioned that you had some very influential English teachers that have really been valuable in this career path that you chose. Did you have any mentors as well that kind of maybe molded your path, molded your thinking, opened up some doors that weren't open before?
I would say particularly in college, there were a couple of people who were very influential. One of them was in the Department of Chemistry at Marietta. He was the department chair, Herschel Gross. And this was when I really came to realize that graduate school was a possibility. It's something that I'd not really thought about. I went to college, I was going to major in chemistry. I figured, well, I'll get a job. There'd be jobs for chemists afterwards. And I even remember the event where we talked about this. And back then, at a small school like Marietta, when we were registering for classes for the following semester, unlike the nice computer system we have here at Virginia Tech, what we did is we'd go to the gym, and they had tables set up for each of the departments, and you'd stand in line at a given department and get a card that pertained to the particular course that you wanted to enroll in that department. And so you went around the gym and collected the cards you needed for that upcoming semester, and you turned them in. And while I was at one of these, Dr. Gross was there, and he asked me what I was planning to do when I graduated. And this was probably at the beginning of my junior year. And I told him I was thinking I'd go to work and so on. And he said, well, have you thought about graduate school? And I said, well, probably not, because that was extra financial burden and so on. And he said, well, in fact, and I think his wording was something like, for every $10 you need to go to graduate school, $11 will be available. And it basically was letting me know that there were assistantships. And at that time, I think it was perhaps even easier to get some of those than it is now, but assistantships available for graduate school. So I began to think of that, and then used that information as I was applying in subsequent years. The other person who was particularly influential at Marietta was Dr. Hans-Georg Gilda, who was primarily an organic chemist. They did not have a separate biochemistry program at Marietta, even though I knew that's what I wanted to do. And if people asked what I was majoring in, I'd say, well, biochemistry. And they said, there isn't such a major. I said, I know, but I'm taking chemistry and then a little bit of biology with it. And that interest came out through high school and so on. But in any case, Dr. Gilda was my research mentor. And I did undergraduate research with him for a couple of years. And at a small school like that, you basically had a lab, and it was you and a couple other undergraduates who were in the lab, and it was pretty much your lab. And so you could do experiments, and the mentor would be around, but it wasn't a large school, and so we didn't have graduate students. The undergraduates were really there, and it was our lab to work in. So I was able to do some undergraduate research, and in fact I did an honors thesis as an undergraduate as well. So I was able, although we didn't publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, I was able to write a thesis and defend it in front of a committee.
Wow, that sounds very interesting. You mentioned a couple of things that I want to go back and highlight. You mentioned that Dr. Rose was the first one who kind of got you thinking about graduate school, and mentioned to you that there's something called assistantships for graduate school. And I'm bringing this point because as you know, teaching several classes, I've had students come up to me, and I've actually been part of graduate school panels discussing graduate school with students coming up to me and said, you know, I really want to end up in academia. I really enjoy this. I really want to go to graduate school, but I don't think I can afford it. And I got these this question, you know, over and over, and I think it's very interesting that a lot of students don't know about these assistantships, these, whether it be a research assistantship where you just predominantly do research, or a teaching assistantship where most of the time you're doing a little bit of research as well as teaching courses. So that graduate schools are can't be affordable. You know, you have a stipend and they are kind of paying you to go to school. So I think that was I wanted to highlight that point. And
well, and I can actually expand upon that because I've encountered the same thing here as well. I advise a lot of undergraduates and even tell them the same story I told you about learning about assistantships, and many of them aren't aware at this point. And so again, it's our chance to help them along that path as well.
Absolutely. And you mentioning Dr. Gross and another individuals that were your mentors. What do you think makes a good mentor? Being a mentor yourself, what are the qualities that make up this individual?
Well, I think one of the things is you really have to care about the students' careers and really make that part of your focus as part of your job. And so I don't mind spending a fair amount of time working with individuals, with students who are coming to me and talking about careers. And I do this at both the undergraduate and graduate level, but among the undergraduates, I serve as one of the undergraduate program directors for the biochemistry department, so I talk to a lot of undergraduates and try to help them think about possible careers. And in many cases, they aren't thinking about graduate school. They're looking for other kinds of jobs. I've had students who have done undergraduate research and come in and said, you know, I just realized I don't want to spend my life in a lab. So we talk about alternatives and other kinds of careers that they could consider, though the one that I can talk about most knowledgeably, of course, is graduate school, since that's how I've proceeded in my career. But just really taking interest and talking to them and listening, because a lot of times just by listening to some of the things they're saying, you can get a better sense of some of their concerns and maybe some idea of the direction they might want to pursue. In other cases, it's things that I really send them to other individuals and say, well, if that's an interest, you really need to talk to this person or that person, because it's in areas that I really don't have the expertise to give them the depth of explanation that might be useful for them.
You mentioned undergraduate research. Would you consider that something very valuable, something that as an individual thinking about science, that this should be something that they should do while an undergrad? And you also mentioned an honors thesis that you did. Is that something also that you would recommend?
Yeah, I definitely recommend undergraduate research, and I talk to all of our students as undergraduates who are thinking, if they're thinking about graduate school and a research career, I say you have to do undergraduate research in some way, whether it be during the academic year for academic credit, or if you're able to find a summer internship through Virginia Tech or through other universities, or in some cases companies, because to be admitted these days to graduate school, they're almost looking for that. And if you haven't really explored your interests in research, they would be reluctant to accept you even if your grades were pretty good, because you don't really know if research is what you want to do. We do have, with biochemistry, we have students doing undergraduate research in a number of different departments around campus, and that enables them to pursue their interests a bit, and certainly for me it was an excellent experience. In fact, while I was an undergraduate, I also got an opportunity to do one of these undergraduate research experiences between my junior and senior years. I went to Argonne National Labs in Illinois and spent 10 weeks or so there, and there was a cohort of, I don't know, we must have had 20 or 30 students from around the country, and again, a great opportunity. And these people weren't all in the biological sciences. There were people in math and physics and so on. So I really got a mix of interest there, and talked to students about their careers and things they were thinking about doing. So that was really valuable. That's also, while I was there, and that's how, in a way, I ended up at Northwestern, is that while I was there, a couple of the other guys and I wanted to look at graduate schools. So we made a trip to Northwestern and got a tour of the facilities there, and then we went to Wisconsin and a couple of other schools just to find out what these graduate programs were like, to meet some of the people, and ultimately then I went to Northwestern, which I really enjoyed when I went there for a visit, and was really glad that I could go there for graduate school. You also mentioned the honors thesis. I encourage students to do that. A lot of them choose not to. It's a lot of extra work. I've had 4 or 5 students over the years, and I've mentored a lot more than that in undergraduate research, who've chosen to do an honors thesis. And it really takes a student, though, who starts research at least by their junior year, if not their sophomore year, so that they have enough time to do a decent job in research and really can spend the last semester writing the thesis. You can't really have a lot of research left in that last semester, or it'll be really difficult to finish the honors thesis. But I've had a few. I had one last year, a couple the year prior to that, and then some a number of years ago.
Yes, I've always highly recommended undergraduate research to my students, and kind of feel a little disappointed when I have a senior coming in their last semester. It's like, oh, I'm interested in graduate school. Do you have any research experience? No. Well, sometimes, like you mentioned, that you kind of have to make those opportunities happen. You might be here at Virginia Tech or at your school and realize, okay, there's not any research here that I might be interested in, but there's possibilities of you going on internship or somewhere else to find a place where you would be interested in doing research. So what do you think makes a successful graduate student? So we talked about a mentor, but how about going back and thinking about your graduate student, graduate period? What do you think will make a successful grad student?
Well, I think back not only to myself, but other graduate students in my cohort while I was in graduate school, or the students I've mentored here at Virginia Tech in some way. And I mean, certainly you have to have a certain amount of intelligence in order to get through graduate school, but that'll be displayed through your undergraduate career, and things, well, GRE scores can be indicative that they're not always the best measure, and I really look a lot at grades, how they've done, the courses they've taken, how they've done in some of the really hard science and math courses that we all take as part of this particular field. And if they've done well there, then that means they certainly have the intellectual aptitude. If another aspect of this will be their real interest in research, and in applying they have to write a personal statement, and you can get a lot from that in terms of what really motivates them, why they're thinking about this particular career, and make sure that it's really something that they're going to be passionate about. You have to be passionate about research, and the best students I've seen are the ones who just like to solve problems and fix things, and because that's what you run into when you do research. And this is sometimes something that wouldn't even necessarily be related to science so much, or their particular scientific discipline, but just their general interest in problem solving. And if they like that, then they have a good chance in graduate school, because that's what they're going to encounter along the way, are all kinds of problems.
Well, you said problems, so I'm wondering, did you have or face any challenges while a graduate student, while pursuing your scientific goals and, you know, coming to where you are right now?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a smooth path, but I don't know that there were any major hurdles. I was in a lab that was reasonably congenial, and so I didn't have to face any major problems within the lab, and there were mentors within the lab who were able to get me started and help me along the way, people I could go to for advice. And there was the usual coursework and so on that went okay, and various other hurdles, but nothing that was really certainly insurmountable. I would say things went reasonably smoothly during graduate school for me.
How did you balance your work life and your personal life? Because I think that some individuals can find that very challenging while going and doing graduate school, and then doing a postdoc, and then some academic position. So how did you manage to do that?
Well, in my case, I wasn't married during graduate school, and so I didn't have that additional obligation, so that made, in some ways, made things a little simpler. It wasn't the reason I wasn't married, I just hadn't met the right person. But in any case, that was something that didn't take additional time. Beyond that, I mean, it's one of those where you have to think a little bit about what interests you for your outside interests, and find things that you can do without taking on too much, and saying yes to too many things and getting involved in a lot of outside activities can really make it difficult, because you do have to focus a lot on the science and on graduate school, and early in your career especially, and getting things going in your career. An academic career is busy all along the way, but the initial years are especially stressful as you're working towards getting tenure and so on. And so it's a matter of finding the things that you enjoy the most, spending your time on those, and not getting too distracted by a lot of other things that you may find interesting but aren't really your major interests, your major passions.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's very good information. Even for me right now, I'm starting my career right now, so I'm very much soaking in what everyone is telling me. So I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the scientific issues that you are currently looking at. So what is your research about?
Okay. Yes, everything I do in the lab now is on computers. We simulate things. It's computational molecular modeling, and that actually is something that's evolved over the years. Back when I was a graduate student, this wasn't even a field one could pursue. The kinds of computers we had back then, and I actually used them for some data analysis, were the kinds of things where the university had one mainframe computer. We didn't have personal computers on our desks as we do now, and the personal computers we have on our desks now are more powerful than those mainframes were years ago. But in any case, it was much more limited field, and it's a field that grew as I was actually a faculty member here at Virginia Tech, where some of these things became possible as software improved, as hardware improved, and now we can do things that were unthinkable many years ago. But in any case, I was able, through the research leave program here at Virginia Tech, I did one research leave for a semester at the University of Virginia. That's been about a little over 20 years ago, and then about 15 years ago, or a little less than that, I was at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. I was able to spend a year there. And during that time I did nothing but molecular modeling, even though I still had a wet lab back here and we had some projects going on. When I came back from that research leave, I thought I would continue to keep my wet lab going as well as have the computational work. But I quickly realized that it was going to work a lot better for me if I could focus just on the computational work. And I'd already established some collaborations while I was at NIEHS on my research leave, particularly one here at Virginia Tech with a faculty member in biological sciences, and we had active funding then for about 10 years from NSF to fund our research, where I would apply computational methods related to protein structure, function, and dynamics, and he was doing the wet lab work, and so we were able to use our complementary methods in trying to, in that case, work with a set of enzymes, some β-glucosidases. Now we continue to use our computational methods, often collaboratively. In some cases they're long-term collaborations. In other cases it might be a relatively short-term. where there's a particular problem someone is working on where the computational methods could complement. In other cases, we have some longer-term things. The kinds of research, one project relates to Alzheimer's disease, another relates to diabetes, obesity, inflammation. Those are the major things going on in the lab. And then some others that we're getting off the ground also are disease-related, but through different protein receptors or enzymes. So in all cases, we apply things like what's called molecular dynamics simulations, where we try to simulate the motion of a protein to try to understand better how it performs its function and responds to, say, binding of small molecules.
Sounds like some amazing research. It really does. So in your specific field, do you think that the normal path to science would be undergrad, graduate school, postdoc, academia, or, and of course, you know, you don't have to go into academia, you can go into industry, but is that what you would recommend, that path, if they're interested in academia?
Well, that's certainly, if they're able to pursue that path, that's the most straightforward approach. And an undergraduate degree for the kinds of things I do in biochemistry or chemistry, at least as a major component of that undergraduate education, is probably what's needed. And then when you get to graduate school, you need to try to complement some of that training with some work perhaps in computer science and statistics, so you have a little bit of training in that and build upon that so that you can apply those methods. I also encourage when my students, especially when my students are interested, to get some wet lab experience, even if they intend to really do their research totally on a project where they're applying computational methods, because I think they really need to see some of what goes on in the lab to have a better appreciation for how data are collected, and it becomes a little more meaningful for them as they're reading papers and so on in the field.
That's very significant, making sure that they have the hands-on experience as well as the virtual reality, you know, experience. So what would you say to a student who wanted to shape his future with a career in science? So what piece of advice would you give to a new scholar?
So let's say a new graduate student, for example. In that case, I'd really encourage them to find the field that they really are passionate about. And hopefully when they've come to graduate school, they've come into a department that is the kind of department that they're particularly interested in. When I'm advising undergraduates about where to go to graduate school, I talk about those same kinds of things. I say you don't want to go to a department where maybe there's only one person doing the kinds of things you want to do, because you may or may not get to work with that person. And so find something that's a little more broadly based. And certainly with the skills that one gets in biochemistry, you can go to a graduate program in biochemistry or also biological sciences. There's some of these umbrella programs in cellular and molecular biology and so on. And many graduate schools will offer these sort of umbrella admissions processes where you could, once you're there, end up in one of a number of departments, and the way you make your decision when you're there is to do lab rotations. And by doing a lot of research on the programs ahead of time and knowing what faculty are associated with these programs, they'll have some idea of the people they would really be most interested in, so that when they get there, they can try to get rotations in those labs, and then after that experience, hopefully be able to pick a research mentor. And that would give them the broadest view and the best chance of getting into a lab and getting into work they really care about. Of course, the other thing I mention is just because you do a certain thing in graduate school doesn't mean you're going to do that for the rest of your life. In fact, there's a good chance you won't as fast as things move. So you really want to get into something that you care about, but that can serve as a springboard for what may come later.
Oh, thank you for that. That's a wonderful piece of advice, and thank you once again for participating in this Scientific Journey project and discussing your path to success. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Bevan.
It's my pleasure.